You think moving to South America will fix your dating life? That's what Anton thought too. Anton's a 54-year-old engineer from Ohio. His wife died 3 years ago. After months of failed dates, he made a plan. Pack his bags, head south. Problem solved. 18 months later, he was broke. Burned out. More alone than when he started. Want to know what went wrong? Anton's story isn't rare. Thousands of men are making this exact mistake right now. They think new geography fixes old psychology. Here's the truth. It doesn't. Today we're breaking down Anton's journey through 3 countries. You'll see why the passport strategy always backfires, and what his failures teach us about grief, attachment, and why men keep running from themselves. The setup, why men pick South America. Let's start with Anton's story, because it explains everything. When his wife died, Anton did what most widowed men do. He ran from his grief. Instead of dealing with his pain, he started planning his escape. South America became his fantasy fix. This is classic avoidance. When real intimacy feels scary, your brain looks for easy answers. Anton told himself American women were too demanding, too independent, too complicated. South American women? In his mind, they were different, traditional, appreciative. But here's what Anton missed. This was all in his head. He was projecting his perfect woman fantasy onto entire cultures. He imagined women who would value his stability without challenging his emotional walls. Women who would appreciate his engineering mind without expecting him to process his grief. This cultural fantasy is huge with widowed men. They're not really looking for partnership. They want validation that skips the hard work of emotional growth. Anton spent 8 months planning. He researched costs, visa rules, dating apps. He joined Facebook groups, watched YouTube videos promising him a better life abroad. Every piece of content said the same thing. Escape your problems. Find traditional women. Live like a king on your Western income. But what was Anton really doing? Running from grief. Instead of building emotional skills and learning to handle intimacy after loss, he chose geographic escape. The validation cycle that international dating feeds is deadly for widowed men. They're vulnerable, lonely, desperate to feel wanted again. When they get attention abroad, it feels like proof their plan worked. Anton burned through his savings on flights and housing before he understood the trap he was walking into. He thought his engineering background made him logical, prepared. He had spreadsheets for everything except his own emotional needs. Here's the reality. Men like Anton aren't choosing South America because they've done the work to be good partners. They're choosing it because they think it's an easier path to feeling wanted. They want connection without vulnerability, intimacy without growth. This creates a pattern that plays out the same way across countries. The same attachment problems that caused issues at home will surface abroad. Often worse because of cultural stress, money pressure, and the isolation of being a foreign man seeking local validation. Colombia, the validation trap. Anton's first stop was Medellin. Within a week, he was getting more dating app matches than he'd seen in 2 years in Ohio. The attention felt incredible after months of loneliness and rejection. This is the validation trap. Anton thought the sudden interest proved South American women appreciated him more than American women. But what was he really experiencing? Love bombing mixed with economic opportunity spotting. Let's talk money reality. Anton calculated his expenses using online cost of living sites. He budgeted $1,200 per month for a comfortable lifestyle. 3 months later, he was spending $2,800. Here's what Anton didn't factor in. The Gringo tax applies to everything. His rent in a decent neighborhood doubled because landlords knew he was foreign. Restaurant prices jumped when he spoke English. Dating expenses exploded because he felt pressure to prove his financial worth. But the real shock came from family expectations. The women Anton dated weren't just individuals. They came with extended family networks that saw him as an economic solution. Suddenly, he was expected to help with medical bills, school fees, household repairs for people he'd never met. Anton tried to rationalize these requests. He told himself this was cultural difference, family values, traditional support systems. What he couldn't see was the pattern. He was mistaking financial dependency for genuine connection. The love bombing made it worse. Women showered him with affection, cooked elaborate meals, introduced him to their families within weeks. Anton felt more appreciated than he had since his wife's death. He thought this proved he'd found what American dating culture was missing. But love bombing isn't love. It's a manipulation technique that creates fake intimacy and emotional dependency. Anton was being targeted not for his personality or compatibility, but for his economic profile, stable income, recent loss, emotional vulnerability, and cultural cluelessness. The Gringo tax wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Anton started questioning his self-worth when every interaction felt transactional. Was he valued as a person, or just as a wallet? The constant money requests made him feel like an ATM instead of a romantic partner. Red flags Anton missed: immediate love declarations, pressure to meet extended family quickly, sob stories about financial emergencies, requests for money transfers to help with temporary problems. These weren't traditional values. They were manipulation techniques designed to exploit his grief and loneliness. The validation high that Anton experienced is common with widowed men abroad. After years of feeling invisible or rejected, sudden attention feels like emotional rescue. But this high doesn't last. It's built on economic disparity, not genuine attraction or compatibility. Anton's crash came when he realized he'd spent $8,000 in 3 months with nothing to show for it, except growing resentment. The women who seemed so interested disappeared when his financial contributions decreased. The validation he craved revealed itself as conditional on his continued economic performance. This pattern repeats across Colombia for men like Anton, because they're seeking external validation to fill internal emotional holes that only grief processing and emotional growth can address. Brazil, complexity overload. After burning through his savings in Colombia, Anton moved to São Paulo. He convinced himself Brazil would be different, more sophisticated, more educated women, better expat community. What Anton discovered instead was social complexity his engineering mind couldn't systematize. The language barrier hit immediately. Unlike Colombia, where his broken Spanish got basic communication, Portuguese felt completely foreign. Anton was stuck in surface conversations, unable to express his thoughts, his grief, or his actual personality. Every interaction felt like charades. This language isolation deepened his psychological isolation. Anton realized he wasn't connecting with women as a person. He was connecting as a foreign novelty who couldn't communicate beyond basic pleasantries. The validation he craved became even more hollow when he couldn't express who he actually was. Brazilian social class navigation proved far more complex than Anton expected. As an engineer, he assumed his professional status would translate directly. Instead, he discovered an intricate hierarchy based on family background, education prestige, neighborhood codes, and cultural capital that his middle-class American experience hadn't prepared him for. Women asked about his university, his family's background, his neighborhood in the States. Anton's straightforward engineering career and suburban Ohio upbringing didn't carry the social weight he expected. He felt constantly judged on metrics he didn't understand. The money pressure intensified beyond Colombia. São Paulo's cost of living for the lifestyle he wanted required significantly more than his fixed pension could support. Anton was spending $3,500 per month just to feel socially acceptable in circles where he hoped to meet educated women. But the real psychological toll came from attachment anxiety triggered by Brazilian dating norms Anton couldn't decode. Brazilian social interactions involve complex layers of flirtation, friendship, and romantic possibility that exist simultaneously. Anton, still processing grief and seeking clear validation, couldn't navigate the ambiguity. He'd meet women who seemed interested, spend weeks building what he thought was romantic connection, only to discover he'd been categorized as a friend or cultural curiosity. The emotional whiplash triggered his attachment wounds in ways Colombian directness hadn't. Anton found himself constantly performing different versions of himself. The psychological exhaustion of this cultural translation became overwhelming. He was performing a version of himself that felt increasingly disconnected from his actual identity and needs. Red flags in Brazil were subtler but more psychologically damaging. Instead of direct financial requests, Anton encountered women who fetishized him as the stable, older American man, a fantasy that reduced him to his passport and bank account rather than appreciating his actual personality or addressing his grief. This fetishization felt different from Colombian transactionalism, but was equally dehumanizing. Anton realized he was being appreciated not for who he was, but for what he represented: financial security, visa opportunities, and exotic foreign status for Brazilian women's own status anxiety. After 6 months in Brazil, Anton's attachment anxiety had intensified rather than healed. The cultural complexity that was supposed to offer more sophisticated connections had instead highlighted his emotional intelligence gaps and deepened his isolation from authentic intimacy. Peru. Rural fantasy meets urban reality. Anton's final destination was Peru. He split time between Lima and smaller cities like Arequipa. By this point, he'd convinced himself his previous failures were due to choosing overly modernized locations. Peru, he reasoned, would offer the traditional values he'd been seeking. What Anton encountered instead was the starkest economic disparity of his entire journey. In Peru, Anton's engineering pension made him wealthy by local standards in ways that felt uncomfortable rather than validating. Women he met weren't just interested in his stability. They viewed him as a potential economic solution for entire extended families facing genuine poverty. The power dynamics became impossible to ignore. When Anton took women on dates, the cost of a single dinner represented a week's wages for many locals. This wasn't the mutual appreciation he'd fantasized about. It was economic desperation disguised as romantic interest. Anton's cultural shock deepened when he realized dating in Peru meant inheriting financial obligations to extended family networks spanning multiple generations. His girlfriend's grandmother needed medical care. Her brother required university tuition. Her cousin's business needed startup capital. These weren't occasional requests like Colombia. In Peru, Anton discovered that being in a relationship meant becoming the financial backbone for families of 15 to 20 people. His fixed engineering income, which seemed generous in Ohio, couldn't support the economic ecosystem he was expected to join. The psychological burden of being seen as an economic solution, rather than a grieving partner seeking genuine connection, finally broke through Anton's denial. Every conversation eventually circled back to financial needs. Every expression of affection felt conditional on his continued economic performance. Traditional gender role assumptions created additional cognitive dissonance for widowed Anton. Peruvian women expected him to be the decisive provider while simultaneously managing all emotional labor in relationships. But Anton was still processing his wife's death and needed emotional support himself. He found himself expected to solve problems, make decisions, and provide stability while receiving little emotional reciprocity. The traditional values he'd idealized turned out to mean traditional expectations that he perform masculine provider roles he wasn't emotionally prepared for. The isolation factor in Peru proved more severe than larger cities. The expat community in smaller Peruvian cities was limited and often consisted of men running from similar problems. Instead of finding support systems, Anton encountered echo chambers of other emotionally unavailable men, justifying their geographic escapism. Red flags. Anton finally began recognizing included family pressure tactics, financial manipulation disguised as cultural obligations, and emotional manipulation that exploited his grief and loneliness. Women would share tragic family stories designed to trigger his protective instincts and open his wallet. By his final months in Peru, Anton realized he was being viewed not as a potential life partner, but as a foreign ATM with citizenship benefits. The traditional values he'd sought were actually traditional exploitation patterns that treated him as an economic resource rather than addressing his need for authentic connection and grief processing. The rural fantasy had become urban reality. He was more isolated, financially drained, and emotionally disconnected, than when he started his South American journey. The burnout pattern. Why men leave. Morphe. After 18 months across 3 countries, Anton hit complete psychological exhaustion. The constant performance of being the grateful foreign man, the cultural code switching, the financial pressure, it all collapsed into burnout. Anton realized he'd been maintaining a false persona throughout his entire journey. In Colombia, he'd played the appreciative Gringo. In Brazil, he'd performed sophisticated international man. In Peru, he'd acted the generous provider. None of these versions felt like his authentic self. The psychological toll of this cultural performance became unsustainable. Anton was exhausted from pretending to understand social cues he didn't grasp, laughing at jokes he didn't get, and navigating relationship dynamics that felt completely foreign to his grief-processing needs. His financial reality finally caught up. Anton calculated he'd spent over $45,000 in 18 months, nearly double his original budget. The hidden costs had accumulated relentlessly. Visa renewals, emergency flights home for family issues, ongoing remittances to women he'd dated, medical expenses from stress-related health problems. His engineer's budget spreadsheets became monuments to his miscalculations. Every country had cost significantly more than projected, not just in money, but in emotional energy and psychological stability. But the real breakthrough came when Anton's emotional intelligence gaps became impossible to ignore under cultural stress. The same attachment issues that created problems in Ohio were now amplified by language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the isolation of being a foreign man seeking validation. Anton's grief hadn't been processed, it had been exported. His attachment anxiety hadn't been resolved. It had been triggered by every cultural interaction he couldn't decode. His need for genuine intimacy hadn't been met. It had been exploited by people who recognized his vulnerability. This is the return-to-sender psychology that catches every man who tries geographic solutions to internal problems. Anton discovered he was recreating the same relationship patterns in every country, just with different languages and cultural contexts. In Colombia, he'd been the desperate widower seeking validation. In Brazil, he'd been the anxious foreigner trying to prove his worth. In Peru, he'd been the emotionally unavailable provider hiding behind financial generosity. Same patterns, different locations. Anton's recognition hit him during a particularly difficult night in Lima. He was arguing with a girlfriend about money, again, when he realized this exact dynamic had played out with his wife before her death. Geographic change hadn't resolved his attachment issues, it had revealed them more clearly. The ethical awakening came gradually, then all at once. Anton started calculating the impact he'd had on local communities and individuals he'd left behind. Women who'd genuinely cared for him, families who'd welcomed him, communities that had invested emotional energy in relationships he'd abandoned when they became inconvenient. He realized he'd been treating entire cultures as his personal healing laboratory, extracting validation and emotional labor without contributing genuine partnership or long-term commitment. The ethical weight of this extraction became unbearable. Anton's final month in South America was spent preparing for return, not just geographically, but psychologically. He'd learned that running from grief doesn't process it. Seeking validation abroad doesn't build self-worth. Geographic change doesn't resolve attachment wounds. The burnout pattern Anton experienced is predictable because it's psychological, not cultural. Men leave South America not because the countries fail them, but because external solutions can't fix internal problems. The same emotional intelligence gaps that created relationship problems at home will surface abroad, often amplified by cultural stress and financial pressure. Anton's story represents thousands of men who discover that passport solutions to attachment problems create more trauma than healing. The solution: what actually works? Anton's core takeaway after returning to Ohio was simple but profound. Location doesn't fix internal relationship programming or grief processing. His 18-month South American journey cost him nearly $50,000 and left him more emotionally disconnected than when he started. So what works instead? First, process your grief locally. Anton needed to work through his wife's death before seeking new relationships. You can't build healthy connections while running from unprocessed loss. Second, build emotional intelligence before you travel. The same communication problems that create issues at home will surface abroad, often amplified by cultural stress. Third, stop seeking external validation. If you're looking for easier attention or women who won't challenge you emotionally, you're not ready for genuine partnership anywhere. Based on Anton's journey, here's a practical red flag checklist for ethical international dating. Are you running from recent loss? Stop. Process it locally first. Are you seeking easier validation? Stop. Build self-worth internally first. Are you expecting cultural differences to solve your attachment issues? Stop. Work on emotional intelligence first. The self-awareness framework for widowed men considering geographic dating starts with one question. Are you seeking genuine partnership or validation that bypasses emotional growth? Your future relationships, wherever they happen, will thank you for doing the internal work before seeking external solutions. Don't be Anton. Don't waste 18 months and $50,000 learning what grief processing and emotional intelligence work could have taught you at home. The passport isn't the problem. Your attachment patterns are. Fix those first. Then travel if you want. But travel as a whole person seeking genuine connection, not as a wounded man running from himself. Because geography doesn't fix psychology. It just gives you new places to repeat old patterns.